Then, as we approached Cockatoo Island, we tried to call Cockatoo Island to see if we could get some more fuel and water. And we got this call from someone from the barge, said that he had some supplies, and he was anchored in Dogleg Creek, and he gave us the coordinates, and a little green buoy was just visible there. And we then went into Dogleg Creek, and you can just see in behind the rock there is a couple of barges, and we then were invited for a barbecue tea with them. They'd been supplying Cockatoo Island with all its goods and took the rubbish away, but they were setting up for a barbecue for the night, and they were having a week's holiday, and they had a camouflage net above the stretched across. They had a kids' swimming pool they filled with a fire pump, a big barbecue, and then they not that I drink much beer, but they had stacks of beer, enough for quite a while, I can assure you. But they were very hospitable. We were able to get some fuel from them, buy some fuel, and then this is the only spot we saw a crocodile visibly on the water, so I don't know how many crocodiles were around as we travelled on. And then as we motored up to horizontal waterfalls to the Barra Shack to drop Alan and Chris off to catch the plane back out of Barra Waterfall, the horizontal waterfalls at the Barra Shack. When we travelled back from the Barra Shack, we were passing outcrops of rock and sand that we were had sailed over the day before, so it gives you an idea of the tides. In fact, we arrived at Colbert Island at 3 o'clock in the morning and anchored in 6 metres of water, and we had another 6 metres of tide to go, so I put out 12 metres of water under us with a fair bit of current and put out the whole 50 metres of chain, but it held pretty well. We then continued on down into Thomas Bay, spent a couple of nights there, came into a very narrow little bay with the aid of the GPS and the electronic chart, and found a bit of shade on the beach, and then continued on our way down to Broome. In Broome we were there when the Melbourne Cup was on, and they celebrated more than I think in Melbourne. But we had to get water, and the only spot we could actually get it from a hose was from the jetty, so we motored over to the jetty, and the wind was blowing us onto the jetty, and when I climbed up to the top we only had about a couple of metres of, or less than that, of mast sticking above the jetty, and you can see how the range of the tide. And we filled up and got off the jetty with a bit of difficulty in my head, and then when I was going back to the mooring, Paula said, "Oh, by the way," she said, in Tagle's book, he said that many a boat had lost its superstructure there from the wind blowing the boats onto the jetty, so I'm glad you told me that after we manoeuvred off the jetty. Yeah. Oh, this is, of course, the big tides mean you've got to drag the tender over the mud, so we're just lucky in Victoria to Port Phillip Bay to have not very high tides. With the phone, we could get phone reception, and of course we used Skype, and as we came down the coast, and we only had a VHF radio, but we were able to talk to a lot of other people as we went along, so there wasn't a necessity to have a HF radio, and they're rather expensive to buy and install. But as Paula and I then continued on from Broome onto Perth by ourselves. Now this is really, this is our first tacking exercise since we left the east, since really going up the east coast, and the boat, because it was laden with a lot of fuel, a lot of water, a lot of supplies, it was down, we might say a bit overloaded for cruising, but I had a lot of equipment and books, which I've since taken off, and it's vastly improved the performance of the boat, getting rid of all that excess weight. So if we haven't used it, it goes out, and that's Paula's motto: if I haven't used it in 6 months, you don't need it. So. But this is as we tacked overnight from 3.5 days from Broome down to Port Sampson near Dampier. So you can see the tacks weren't all that efficient, but maybe it was in the middle of the night when we weren't all that efficient. But we then took the 3.5 days to get on to Port Sampson. We had a few visitors from time to time. We had the birds that were landing on the deck and on the rails, and they just kept us company as we went on. The advantage of this we found is that all our navigation and all our operations took place upstairs. You could sleep along the bunk, and we opted for 2-hour watches. As we travelled further south, in where we did 3 days from Exmouth to Carnarvon, and then a night in Carnarvon, and 3 days and 3 nights to Geraldton. We went on for 2-hour watches, 2 hours on, 2 hours off, but you were close by in case you were needed if it wasn't tacking properly, or the wind changed, or needed some correction for the navigation. But you can sleep along the bunks quite comfortably. This is coming into Dampier, and you don't realise how much development is on the Western Australian coast and how much is being exported. And of course, you've got to keep an eye on these big boats as they travel along the coast. And of course, the other thing we had to watch out for is pearl farms with their buoys, as I mentioned earlier. We're in Onslow, and we were able to get fuel and food at the local shopping centre, but they advertised mud wrestling in the hotel on the Friday night, and we opted to keep going instead of going to the mud wrestling. We then island hopped across to Exmouth, and we had a fair bit of wind there for about 3 days, and all the trawlers were taking all their gear off in readiness for the cyclone season. Their season was over, and they were doing maintenance, and we then left Exmouth when it was fairly windy, but we knew the wind was dropping, and we then sailed for 3 days and 3 nights out into the Indian Ocean, and we had our first disagreement out 50 miles out to sea. I'd bought all these tea towels because I read somewhere that if you have clean tea towels you won't get gastro, and I had 20 of them, and Paula said she had 5 children and never got gastro, and she was in charge of changing tea towels. So that's the only disagreement we had on the whole journey. So we arrive in Geraldton in the Gascoyne River at 8 o'clock in the morning, and we stayed there. It was Paula's birthday. We knew it was election day. So we voted, and the next morning we turned the radio on, and that's as much as we were involved with the election. We didn't hear all the hype that went on before the election. So if you want to get away from politics, go sailing. And then when we left there, another 3 days and 3 nights, we then went past Cartog Island into Geraldton, where we aimed to get there by the end of November, and we got there on the 29th of November. And we tied the boat up there to leave it for 3 months and covered it with mesh so the seagulls wouldn't settle in it. And the little harbour we're in, they didn't have a core, and the water would come through the rocks, and you get this surge, and there was this constant surge, and Geraldton's a very windy place. And but no, we tied it up, and people kept an eye on it, and we left it there for 3 months, and when we came back we just hosed the dust off, and we had to wait a couple of 10 days because we're on the tail end of a cyclone. Then on to, then continuing down the south, and then we came into Challenger Harbour in Perth. Now if you see, my sea wind is the first boat on the right hand side. You can see that the anti-fouling is below the waterline because of the weight I'm carrying, whereas the other sea wind here is got plenty of freeboard on the anti-foul. But he was only going back and forth to Rottnest Island and cruising around. He didn't have all the gear that I carried. But I believe that I needed all the gear and all the food and the thing to make our journey the success it was. We then left with John Clayton. John came back, and then John and I and Paula headed. We're going to do the Dubai.